Donald the Duck Duckworth had been a private detective in Maryville, the dirtiest corner of Southern California, for 12 long years. His bread and butter cases involved tracking down lost pets, AWOL husbands, and the occasional reptile. It was unglamorous work, but it paid the bills barely. Ronald, who went by Donald or just Duck to most, was in a slump. Cases had been few and far between lately, and his bank account was hurting because of it. Duck had been digging through trash in an alley off 7th and Forrester, searching for the final clue to wrap up the Morrison embezzlement case. Mr. Morrison was convinced his ne'er-do-well younger brother had been skimming from the family business for years, and he'd hired Duck to prove it. Duck's perseverance finally paid off as he unearthed the shredded bank documents from the dumpster. "Gotcha," he muttered in satisfaction. The paper trail was complete. Morrison's suspicions were confirmed. Just as Duck was pocketing the evidence, he heard shouts and pounding footsteps echoing down the alley. "Catch that cat!" a woman's voice cried out. 3 burly, rough-looking men barreled past, nearly knocking Duck over. The last one, a squirrely guy with a thin mustache, skidded to a stop. "Hey, mister, you seen a cat come through here?" he asked, his facial hair wiggling like a caterpillar as he spoke. Duck shook his head and the man took off again. As their footsteps faded, a rustling sound drew Duck's attention back to the dumpster. To his astonishment, a bedraggled black cat emerged from the trash bags and fixed him with a look, as if imploring him to keep quiet. Before Duck could react, the cat sprang to a window ledge and scampered up to the roof. Duck's curiosity was piqued. Ignoring the voice in his head urging him to take the Morrison evidence straight to the bank and collect his fee, he decided to follow the mystery feline. The cat led him on a merry chase across Maryville's seediest neighborhoods before eventually squeezing through a crack into the abandoned Carson slaughterhouse on the outskirts of town. "Thanks for keeping eyes on that flea bag, pal," the mustached one called out. "But we'll take it from here. Mind if I ask what you want with a stray cat?" Duck replied casually. "Wrong question." The trio rushed him in unison. Duck dodged the first few blows and even landed a couple solid punches of his own before a fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. The men delivered a few vicious kicks to his ribs for good measure. "Stay out of our business if you know what's good for you," the apparent leader, an older man with steel-gray hair, snarled. Then they took off into the slaughterhouse. Duck lay there catching his breath and taking inventory of his injuries. Nothing seemed to be broken, but he'd have some colorful bruises by morning. The smart thing would be to cut his losses now, turn over the Morrison evidence, and use that fee to pay his overdue rent. But Duck's gut was telling him this cat caper was worth pursuing. After all, why would 3 tough customers be so intent on nabbing one scrawny stray? Hauling himself to his feet with a groan, Duck limped to a hidden vantage point across from the slaughterhouse and hunkered down to observe. The men spent hours scouring the abandoned building, but judging by their irritated muttering as they finally gave up the search, they still hadn't found their quarry. "What are we going to tell the dame?" the mustached one, who seemed to be named Fred, asked nervously as they passed by Duck's hiding spot. "Shut it and let me think," the older man, apparently George, snapped back. Even in the dark, Duck could see the worry etched on all of their faces. Clearly, they had a lot riding on catching that cat. Once he was certain the coast was clear, Duck snuck into the slaughterhouse. Shards of broken window glass crunched under his shoes as he navigated the dark, cavernous space. "Here, kitty, kitty," he called softly, not really expecting a response. To his surprise, the black cat materialized out of the shadows and sauntered over to him, meowing in greeting. "Well, hey there, little fella," Duck said, crouching down and extending his hand. "What kind of pickle have you gotten yourself into?" The cat sniffed his fingers curiously before promptly climbing up his arm and ducking into his open jacket. Duck chuckled and cupped a protective hand over the furry black head, poking out of his inside pocket. "I guess you're coming with me then," taking a circuitous route to throw off any potential tails. Duck eventually made it back to the dingy one-room apartment he called home and office. The first blush of dawn was just lightening the sky. He improvised a litter box out of an old shoebox and sand procured from the building's maintenance closet. After providing the cat with an empty tuna tin, some water, an old blanket for a bed, he collapsed onto his own rickety mattress. "Make yourself at home, little buddy," he mumbled drowsily. "We'll figure this out after some shut-eye." The cat tucked himself into a tight ball of black fur next to Duck and began to purr. The midday sun was slanting through Duck's threadbare curtains when he finally dragged himself back to consciousness. He switched on the TV, catching the tail end of a news report about a daring jewel heist that had taken place the previous day. $2 million worth of diamonds, destined for the necks and ears of Europe's elite, had vanished without a trace. Duck let out a low whistle as he shuffled over to start a pot of coffee. As the fragrant brew began percolating, Duck was hit by a noxious odor that definitely was not coffee. Nose wrinkled in disgust, he followed the smell to the makeshift litter box, expecting to find an unpleasant gift from his furry houseguest. Instead, his jaw dropped open in shock. Glinting in the sand were 8 perfect, sizable diamonds. Hands shaking, Duck picked one up and held it to the light, ascertaining it was no fake. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "Looks like I cracked that jewel heist without even knowing I was on the case." He looked over at the cat, who was watching him from atop a stack of case files, eyes narrowed inscrutably. "You are just full of surprises, aren't you, little fella? I think you and I are going to make quite the team." And so, that was how Duck and Paws Detective Agency was born. Duck fenced the diamonds through a discreet contact, making more than triple what the Morrison case would have paid. He used the money to fix up the office, buy a new set of wheels, and set himself and his new partner up very comfortably. Word got around about the private eye with the magic cat, who always managed to sniff out the goods. Paws, as the cat came to be known, proved invaluable in cracking cases. He had an uncanny knack for ferreting out clues, squeezing into tight spaces, and charming information out of witnesses. With the dynamic duo on the case, no secret was safe in Maryville. Of course, their notoriety also drew some unwanted attention, particularly from the trio who had been after Paws originally. It turned out they worked for the notorious jewel thief Vivian Vanderveen, who was furious that Duck had recovered her hard-stolen diamonds. George, Fred, and the third stooge, whose name turned out to be Lyle, made it their mission to put Duck out of commission and snatch Paws. But the detective and his feline friend proved a wily duo. Time after time, they outmaneuvered Vivian's henchmen, sometimes with clever ruses and disguises, other times with good old-fashioned fisticuffs. Duck even began to suspect Paws was more than just a remarkably intelligent cat. He displayed almost human-like reasoning at times, like the time they were investigating a murder at the Museum of Art. The victim was the museum curator, found bludgeoned by a Mesopotamian fertility goddess statue. Duck had his suspicions about the assistant curator, a mousy woman named Darlene, but couldn't find any proof. He was searching the museum after hours, bouncing theories off of Paws as the cat prowled alongside him. "I know Darlene had means and opportunity, buddy, but what was her motive? She's worked here for 15 years and was next in line for the curator job anyway. Why risk it all and do the deed now?" Paws meowed urgently and pawed at an air vent down near the baseboards. Duck raised an eyebrow. "You think there's something in there?" The cat meowed again, more insistently this time. Shrugging, Duck pried open the grate and reached inside, fishing around until his fingers brushed against something. He pulled out a lady's lace glove, smeared with what looked like dried blood. Duck turned to Paws in amazement. "This puts Darlene at the scene, all right. But how did you?" He shook his head. "Oh, never mind. Let's get this to the police lab. If that's the curator's blood, then we've got our murderer dead to rights." And so it went. The unconventional gumshoes continued to clean up the mean streets of Maryville, putting away jewel thieves, murderers, antiquity smugglers, and more. Vivian and her boys kept on trying to catch Paws, but the canny cat ran circles around them every time. Then one night, Duck came home to find the place ransacked and Paws nowhere to be found. There were clear signs of a struggle, with overturned furniture, shredded curtains, and blood spatters. And pinned to the front door with a large dagger was a note in Vivian's extravagant scrawl. Bring the Hanover Ruby to Pier 9 at midnight, or the cat gets fitted for cement booties. No cops or else. Fo. Duck swore violently and punched the door, ignoring the pain that shot through his knuckles. The Hanover Ruby was a massive crimson gem he'd been hired to protect during its exhibition at the museum. Vivian must have found out somehow, and now she was using Paws as a bargaining chip to get her greedy hands on it. Hang tight, buddy, Duck muttered grimly, strapping on his shoulder holster. I'm coming for you. At midnight on the dot, Duck pulled up to the deserted pier in a rented sedan. Popping the trunk, he hauled out a small briefcase, handcuffed to his wrist. Vivian emerged from the shadows, flanked by her 3 goons. She looked like a Hollywood silver screen siren in a skin-tight sequined gown, fur stole, and elbow-length black gloves. Mr. Duckworth, she purred, red lips curving in a predatory smile. So good of you to be prompt. You have my ruby. Where's my cat? Duck demanded, glaring at her over the briefcase. Vivian snapped her fingers and Lyle came forward, clutching a yowling, squirming burlap sack. The flea bag is fine. For now. Hand over the ruby and you can have your mangy partner back. Duck hesitated, jaw clenched. Vivian arched one perfectly plucked eyebrow. Or would you prefer to go fishing for cat corpses come dawn? Your choice? Seamus. Shoulders slumping in apparent defeat, Duck unlocked the handcuffs and tossed the briefcase at Vivian's feet. She bent to pick it up, greed gleaming in her eyes. Wise decision. I knew you were a reasonable HEY. Quick as a flash, Duck drew his revolver and shot the briefcase out of her hands, sending it skittering across the dock. At the same moment, Paws burst out of the burlap sack in a yowling blur of claws and teeth, attaching himself to Lyle's face. Chaos erupted on the pier as Duck traded shots with Vivian, who had produced a pearl-handled derringer from her cleavage. George and Fred rushed him, but Duck managed to hold his own, cracking George over the head with a right hook and kicking Fred in the family jewels. Meanwhile, Paws was a one-cat wrecking crew, hissing and slashing and sending Vivian's henchmen crashing into crates and tumbling off the dock. The firefight ended abruptly when police sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly closer. Come on, Paws. Time to scram, Duck yelled. The cat disentangled himself from a moaning Lyle and leaped into Duck's arms. Together they fled to the getaway car Duck had stashed a few blocks over, leaving a cursing Vivian and her battered boys to be scooped up by the cops. Back at the office, Duck collapsed into his chair and grinned at Paws, who was cleaning his paws contentedly on the desktop. Nice job, partner. Knew I could count on you. The cat paused in his ablutions and looked at Duck with an expression that could only be called smug. Duck's grin widened as he reached for the phone. Let's ring the museum and let them know their ruby is waiting at the police station. Then what do you say we blow this burg for a while? I hear Catalina Island is nice this time of year. Paws meowed in what sounded like hearty agreement. He hopped into Duck's lap and together they began making plans for a well-deserved island vacation, their first of many adventures to come. And so life settled into a new, happy rhythm for the private eye and his feline friend. With Paws by his side, Donald the Duck had found his calling. No longer the lonely gumshoe scraping by on two-bit lost pet jobs. He was now a bona fide detective with the coolest partner in town. And if that partner occasionally coughed up a hairball in his coffee mug or left paw prints on freshly typed reports, well, that was just part of the Duck and Paws brand. Maryville's dynamic duo, cleaning up the streets one hissing stakeout and knocked out ne'er-do-well at a time. With his buddy Paws on the case, Duck reflected, life was pretty damn swell indeed.